While many wrestling companies throughout history have had several wrestlers who could be slotted into the role of top guy at any given time, in WWE, the philosophy has always been to pick one person and place them above all else. That's how we got figures such as Bruno Sammartino, Hulk Hogan, and Steve Austin, just as it's how we also got John Cena and Roman Reigns too. But what about the person who has to settle for second place behind them in the pecking order? Surely this must be frustrating. Well, while that might be true, it doesn't make these performers any less great. But who are the biggest examples of this? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. So join us as we take a deep dive into living in their shadows, wrestlers who played second fiddle to top stars. And if we're going to start anywhere with this one, let's do so by venturing all the way back to the days of the WWF, a time before Vince McMahon took over the company and transformed it into his sports entertainment spectacular. And because of that, back then, there was much less in the way of pantomime pomp and circumstance, with the focus instead being on Bruno Sammartino and his record-setting run on top. Hell, so dominating would Bruno be, he'd at one point hold the WWF title for 2,803 days, something which made it all the harder for his protege Larry Zbyszko to stand out when he decided he wanted to. Yes, back in the late 70s, after having spent years under the tutelage of the champ, Zbyszko realized it was his time to shine on top. So feeling like the only way to prove himself to fans was by beating his mentor then, the Chicago native challenged Sammartino to an exhibition bout on January 22, 1980. But after finding out he was still wildly outclassed in terms of skill during this one, the challenger did the only thing he could think of to get the upper hand, and that was to lay out his opponent with a chair. Of course, this had the knock-on effect of turning him heel in the eyes of the live crowd, as anyone who would attack their hero in such a manner was deemed simply too evil to exist. Not that this mattered much for Zbyszko though. No, as a result of his actions that night, he'd instantly become the number 2 star in the company, one who was now high enough on the pecking order to get a lengthy feud with the champ. But even that wasn't enough for him, as what he really wanted was to be number 1, the undisputed top guy in all of New York. So he kept pushing himself to beat Bruno then, with all this leading to the pair having a final epic showdown at Shea Stadium on August 9th of that year, with this one being held inside of a steel cage. Still, no matter how much he prepared, no matter how good he got ahead of time, in the end, Larry just couldn't best Bruno once the bell rang. But then, how could he ever do such a thing? After all, this was the living legend, the Italian superhero, the greatest WWF champion of all time. No, the reality was that, even if he pushed himself to his absolute limits, the Chicago boy would always end up playing second fiddle to his former mentor. But that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Sure, he wasn't number 1, but he was still in a very good spot regardless of this. Hell, in the right circumstances, being second place could actually be advantageous. And this is something that Jimmy Snuka found out a few years later when he was standing in the shadow of the next face of the company, Bob Backlund. But let's rewind a second to give some context. After Bruno Sammartino decided to finally hand over the mantle of top guy in WWF once and for all in 1978, it was Backlund who took it and ran with it as the new ace. That said, for as good as he was in the ring, and for as much as he espoused the all-American values Vince McMahon Sr. was looking for, the champ didn't exactly have the same level of charisma and character as his precursor. No, one of the biggest criticisms against him was that he was pretty dry all around, which was exactly why, as the early 80s came around, fans began to gravitate more towards Jimmy Superfly Snuka. But then, why wouldn't they? After all, Snuka was flashy and full of life, the kind of person who would always draw your eye towards him. The only problem was during his initial run in New York, he was also being looked at as a heel. So realizing audiences didn't want to boo him then, the boss started the process of turning Superfly babyface soon thereafter, with all this leading to his now iconic program against Don Morocco where, on October 17, 1983, the fan favorite leapt from the top of a steel cage and delivered the big splash heard around the world. That said, for as over as he was here, he would still be playing second fiddle to the man who held the gold going forward. Why was this? Well, as far as Vince Sr. was concerned, Bob Backlund remained the best man to represent the company as its champion on account of his legitimate amateur wrestling credentials. The way he saw it, in fact, keeping Snuka as his number 2 babyface meant he could have the best of both worlds, a legit wrestler on top and a charisma machine there to draw fans in for the rest of the show. And to some degree, this turned out to be a good thing for the Fiji native, as it meant not having to worry about carrying the whole company on his shoulders. He was able to let himself be himself at all times, something which regularly delighted fans. Sure, being himself also led to some controversies further down the line, but just because he was never the face of WWF, it made it that much easier for Vince Jr. to just carve Jimmy out of the picture at this point once he became implicated in the death of his girlfriend, Nancy Argentino. So really, having Superfly be second place to Bob Backlund was a perfect choice in hindsight. Just as, in spite of how great Randy Savage was, it was probably the right choice to have him play second fiddle to Hulk Hogan during the mid-80s. Yes, the Macho Man was a legend, one of the biggest of all time in fact, but no matter how good he was never going to be able to match the star power of Terry Bollea during that decade. After all, if it wasn't for Hulkamania, there likely never would have been a boom period at this point. So the idea that anyone else could fill the role of top guy back then feels silly to even consider. But even if he could never usurp Hogan for his throne, that didn't mean Savage wasn't able to make quite a career for himself as a solid number 2. Hell, at points he was even briefly able to overshadow the Hulkster in doing so, perhaps most notably at WrestleMania 3 when he stole the show during his match with Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. And because he was so dependable as a second-place player, it meant when the champ needed to take some time off in 1988 to go film his role in No Holds Barred, the Macho Man was the perfect choice to pick up the mantle for a while, as he became one of the rare people not named Hulk Hogan to become WWF champion during that era. Sure, he'd drop it back to his chief rival again at WrestleMania 5, as was the plan. That said, even in his loss here, Savage managed to create magic and further proof that he was arguably always the better of the two, as his jealousy over the Hulkster's apparent lust for Miss Elizabeth was the driving force between the Megapowers explosion, one of the greatest stories WWF ever told. But the Ohio native wasn't the only number 2 of the Hulkamania era as it happened. No, while during the first half he may have served as the obvious choice for such a spot, by the time the late 80s rolled around, he'd arguably been usurped by a complete force of nature. Who are we talking about here? Why, the Ultimate Warrior, of course. Yes, today he might be better remembered as the guy everyone in the industry hates on account of his less than friendly demeanor while he was alive, but back in 1987, Jim Hellwig was nothing less than a phenomenon, a force of nature made up of face paint and colorful tassels which served as a direct shot of adrenaline into the arm of fans as soon as his entrance music hit. So needless to say, after a run with the Intercontinental title starting in 1988, fans soon began wondering when the Warrior was going to get a shot at the top prize in WWF, then still being held by Hulk Hogan. And it appears Vince McMahon noticed this, because in a move which had never been seen in New York back then, he decided to put his top 2 babyfaces against each other at WrestleMania 6, with the stipulation being that whoever came out on top would hold all the gold. Of course, such a move split audiences down the middle, as while many were still loyal to Hogan, others had since completely moved over to the Warrior train. And that created quite an atmosphere once the time came for the bell to ring at Skydome in Toronto on April 1st, 1990, the very place where the up-and-comer would finally reach the top of the mountain once he pinned the champ clean in the middle of the ring. That said, this would not mark the end of the story, as, even if it had at first seemed like Jim Hellwig had now been anointed the new top guy in WWF, as the months went on and his title reign failed to draw, it became apparent that the boss may have been a little too eager in giving him the top spot. Sure, he had been massively over when he was the Intercontinental champ, but once the weight of the company itself was placed on his shoulders, the Ultimate Warrior just didn't have what it took to surpass the Hulkster. And so that was why, come the time of WrestleMania 7 a year later, the strap would be back around the waist of Hogan, and the once heir to the throne would be pushed back down to the level of number 2. Again though, this wasn't necessarily a bad role for him, as it still allowed the Indiana native to play a key part on the show going forward. That was when he wasn't getting in backstage disputes with Vince McMahon, of course. Yes, in the end, the Warrior's biggest enemy was himself, something which meant that by the time the late 90s rolled around, he'd be persona non grata in New York. Not that this mattered much to WWF though, as they by then already had a new top 2, with that being the undisputed ace of the era, Steve Austin, and his second fiddle, The Rock. Now, we know to call The Rock second fiddle might seem insane on the face of things, as he's arguably the biggest mainstream crossover star in the history of wrestling. On top of that, he was so wildly over with audiences during the Attitude Era that when the Rattlesnake fell to injury in late 1999, it was the Great One who picked up the ball and carried the company through arguably their best year ever in 2000 as the top babyface. That said, it remains undeniable that whenever Austin was there, he was always the real number one, something which was evident throughout his entire feud with Vince McMahon in 1998 and 1999, the very feud which probably saved the company from bankruptcy if we're being honest. And while his absence in 2000 may have allowed the People's Champion to briefly take up the mantle of Vince's Golden Goose, as soon as the Texas native made his comeback towards the end of that year, it was immediately clear where he stood in the pecking order going forward. Need any evidence The Rock was always in the shadow of his main rival during the turn of the millennium? Just look at the 10 singles matches the two had against each other throughout this period. Yes, from their first showdown at D-Generation X in Your House on December 7th, 1997, all the way up to their final bout at WrestleMania 19 on March 30th, 2003, Dwayne Johnson only won one. But again, as with all the other second fiddles before him, it wasn't as if this held The Rock back at all. No, given the sheer force of his charisma, he was able to shine bright anyway, so much so that in terms of the mainstream, he'd eventually go to even greater heights than Austin by becoming the biggest movie star in Hollywood. That's right, while he may have been behind the Rattlesnake in the ring, on the silver screen the California native is very much the number one draw, as can be clearly seen in his roles in the likes of the Fast and Furious franchise. That said, it must still stick in his craw somewhat that no matter how much he got over during the late 90s and early 2000s, no matter how many great moments he created, he'll always be remembered as the guy who was almost the top star in the ring, and who no doubt would have been had he not existed at the same time as the biggest draw in the history of wrestling. Yes, it can be a hard thing to accept that even if you're a legend in your own right, being around when a generational star is doing their thing is not always going to be enough to overshadow you to some degree. But at least it's not just The Rock who had to deal with this, because a few years later, the same thing would happen when Edge had to contend with being a pretender to John Cena's throne. Of course, everyone had to deal with that same reality back in the mid-2000s though, as following the exit of both Steve Austin and The Rock from the ring, it was Big Match John who eventually established himself as the new face of WWE going forward. How had he done such a thing? Well, by being an incredibly charismatic performer, one who was able to play to the younger audience so well that they quickly took to him as their new superhero. That said, this also angered a bunch of adult male fans, as to them, Cena represented a regression from the edgier Attitude Era they'd come to know and love. So because of this, whenever he hit the ring during the time period, it would be a very mixed reaction for the champ. And that meant his opponents often got a mixed reaction too, even if they were portrayed as the clear heels in the situation, with a lot of people choosing to cheer for anyone who stood in opposition to the West Newbury native. It's just as well then that the person who stood most strongly in opposition to Big Match John during his early days as the top guy was the slimiest of all heels, Edge. Yeah, after creating a new villainous character for himself in the mid-2000s, it was very hard not to boo the rated R superstar. Of course, some fans still got behind him even though he was playing the heel, and that helped to create a magical feud between the pair. But even if the bouts and angles were regularly excellent, it was always clear that Cena was number one, even during those times when Edge was holding the WWE title. Why was this? Well, no matter how great the Canadian was as a heel champ, the understanding was he was always going to lose it back to John eventually. And eventually this came to be understood by fans so much that once Edge was pretty much given the role of SmackDown's head boy, it made the Blue brand feel inferior to Raw overall, as that show had the real ace on it. But Edge isn't the only person who was playing second fiddle to John Cena during the 2000s and early 2010s. No, far from it in fact, because over on Monday nights during the same time period, it was Randy Orton who was regularly struggling to escape his shadow. Sure, it didn't have to be this way, as back in the early 2000s, Orton at one point looked like he was going to be the guy who picked up the baton which had been dropped by Steve Austin. That said, with an attitude at the time which could be politely described as petulant, causing management to be wary of giving him such a role, it meant Big Match John instead stepped up to the plate in his absence and carried WWE forward. Yes, while this turned out to be the better decision in the long run as Cena ended up morphing into the biggest star of his generation, there's an interesting alternate universe out there where the Viper filled that spot instead. Hell, he was clearly capable of it in the ring based on his work throughout the era, because not only did he manage to become a 14-time world champion before all was said and done, but he'd also have a number of classic encounters with his main rival. Yes, after a while it became a feud so played out it was probably even more tiresome than Roman Reigns versus Brock Lesnar, but during the early bouts between Orton and Cena, it was pure magic. And this helped to establish the Knoxville native as a solid number 2 over on the Red brand then, a position he held throughout the entirety of the decade with pride. That said, such a role would be challenged by the time the 2010s rolled around, as at this point, a new babyface star was beginning to appear over the horizon. All he needed was a spark to light the fuse which would send him to the top, and luckily, that spark occurred during his now infamous pipe bomb. That's right, we're talking about CM Punk. Yes, after he launched himself into the stratosphere during the spring of 2011, the Second City Saint was all anyone wanted to talk about. Hell, you could make a solid argument that he was well equipped to be the man to take the mantle from John Cena at this point, as with his catastrophic levels of overness and counterculture attitude which fit in perfectly with the time, he was just about the only person who could have dragged WWE back into the mainstream. In the end, though, a decision to cool him off during a feud with Triple H and Kevin Nash led to Phil Brooks eventually having to settle for second place, even as he was holding on to the WWE title for 434 days. But how could he be anything less than the top guy while undergoing such a lengthy run as champ, we hear you ask? Well, the answer to that question is because Big Match John was always treated like the bigger deal, and as a result, was usually placed above Punk in the main event spot. Needless to say then, while for others, being second fiddle was something they grew to accept, Chicago's favorite son couldn't do this, and so because of that, his frustration built to a point where, in January of 2014, he spectacularly quit the company, and from there, disappeared from the ring altogether for the next 7 years. Sure, he would eventually come back, but it wouldn't be with WWE, maybe because he knew if he did return while Vince McMahon was still in charge, he was always going to be positioned behind the person considered to be the real top star. And in the current decade, given that John Cena is all but retired, this honor has now been bestowed upon Roman Reigns. But while Reigns is undoubtedly the king of New York today, he also has a solid number 2 nipping at his heels. And as it happens, this number 2 is someone very close to him, as it's his former Shield stablemate, Seth Rollins. That's right, at any other time, the Architect could very easily have been the ace of the company, but unfortunately for him, he just happens to exist during the same period as the Tribal Chief. And this has meant that while he's regularly been the best wrestler in the company, someone who can always be relied upon to put on a show-stealing performance, his positioning has always felt lower down than it should. And sure, you could argue that for much of Reigns' run, his push felt forced, and so it would have actually fit better if Seth was the man. But ever since the head of the table turned heel in 2020 and became the leader of the Bloodline, he's been able to transform himself into the superstar he always knew he could be. Of course, then this means no matter how good Rollins is, there's just no way he could ever take the crown from the king. Still, at least he's been able to carve out a solid main event role for himself as the workhorse of the company outside of this, meaning that to many hardcore fans, he might be considered their secret ace, even if he isn't recognized as such by the boss. Seriously, with AJ Styles now winding down and Bryan Danielson having jumped to AEW, it's hard to think of a better in-ring wrestler in WWE than the Iowa native. And that's exactly what's led him to recently becoming the inaugural World Heavyweight Champion on Raw, as realistically there was no one better suited for the role. So we guess it just goes to show, even if you're living in the shadow of a bigger star, you can still be an important figure yourself. After all, everyone we've looked at today is a legend in their own right, and that's even more impressive in some ways, considering they never had the honor of being given the brass ring in order to help them get there.